Welcome to your fourth lecture in the Criminality, Psychopathology and Deviance module. This week we're going to explore the realm of mental disorders and crime. As we go along, So as we go along, we're going to look at some of the different categories of mental disorders. Worth stating again today, we've said this several times already in previous weeks, but the vast majority of people who have some form of mental illness do not commit crime. They might occasionally come to the attention of police if they're having a crisis moment in somewhere public perhaps, and the police arrive to help them rather than to arrest them. But by and large, they very rarely commit crime. However, clearly there are some mental disorders which do overlap into the realm of crime, and those are the ones we're going to be chiefly having a look at. And then targeting more specifically on the criminal-related issues, including some demographic information as we go around rates of mental illness and so forth. And then we'll finish by looking at a case study of a real-life convicted criminal, a mass murderer, called Robert Picton, who's a Canadian criminal. Rather unpleasant case. We'll plough on with that as we go. When we do the Q&A live chat through virtual classrooms, obviously it's worth bearing in mind that mental illness affects a lot of people. One charity estimates it's something like 1 in 4 people at some point in their lifetime will have an experience of mental illness, which doesn't mean necessarily for the whole of their life. It could be a very short-term thing, but it will affect a large swathe of people. So there may be people in the class who either have had their own experiences, or a relative or a close friend has had an experience. And so when we're discussing in the Q&A, if we make an extra effort to be particularly sensitive, considerate of other people, and the fact that some of these issues may be very close to home. So we start with a little bit of legal background. In this country, and obviously other countries will have different laws, but in this country, the Mental Health Act from '83 breaks down 4 legal categories of mental illness. Now, I have to emphasise this is legal categories, so this is only the understanding of mental illness as far as a court is concerned when it comes to criminal issues. This is not a statement of psychiatric understanding, as would be used in a hospital or a therapy setting. This is just for the purposes of the courtroom. So those 4 categories are mental illness itself, psychopathic disorder, which these days is referred to as something else, but we'll stick with the categories we've got on the screen for the moment. Mental impairment, which is various forms of learning disability or brain damage, for example. So it can be brain damage or it can be genetic things that people have been born with. Severe mental impairment is essentially the same thing but much more pronounced, which would severely incapacitate an individual's ability to understand the nature of a criminal procedure and participate in the trial, if indeed they are on trial. The Mental Health Act of 2007 replaces this with a much more singular definition, which is any disorder or disability of the mind. So the or disability part incorporates what was previously the mental impairment and severe mental impairment. So someone who has a pronounced learning difficulty or some other kind of damage to their cognitive functioning, which would limit their understanding of the procedures taking place in the courtroom. In terms of understandings of mental illness and mental health, they have changed a lot over the years, and the kinds of categories and terminology used has progressed and changed a number of times over in response to changes within the categories and definitions used by psychiatrists in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual, and in the international measures of mental illness as well. Now, one category that's remained fairly constant over the passage of time is that of neurotic disorders, which stems all the way back to the days of Sigmund Freud, who defined neurosis as a pronounced form of anxiety. but, critically, an anxiety that was disproportionate to the level of risk or threat. So, in other words, if your anxiety is quite in keeping with the situation facing you, then it's not a mental disorder. It's only if the neurosis is perceived to be out of scale to the size of the issue somebody is worried about or disturbed by, that it becomes definable as some kind of mental illness. Now, that does involve a degree of perception. Obviously, what I might consider an acceptable level of worry, somebody else might think is very mild or indeed completely excessive. So there is a degree in which one person's perceptions may vary to another, but given that it is psychiatrists who do the diagnosing, it is their perceptions that carry the most weight when it comes to determining whether or not somebody will be given a diagnostic label. Now, the sorts of issues we're looking at, you have on the screen here. So it can be low levels of anxiety and worry, what's sometimes referred to as free-floating anxiety. That is to say, a person is almost permanently worried, even if they're not wholly sure themselves quite what it is that they're worried about. They just feel worried about everything and anything. It's not one specific thing, and it's quite tiring and wearing for them. There are other levels of anxiety disorders which we'll get onto, with more pronounced levels of anxiety, which sometimes might be more fixed on particular topics, particular issues that seem to provoke anxiety and fear and worry. Phobias, obviously most people are fairly familiar with the notion of a phobia. Arachnophobia, fear of spiders, in which the level of fear shown towards a spider is totally disproportionate to the amount of threat posed by a spider. Now, obviously, that does slightly depend on where you live in the world, in that there are some parts of the world that do have poisonous spiders, quite dangerous spiders, where it would be quite sensible to be fearful or cautious, at least, of those spiders and not getting too close to them. However, in Britain we have, well, aside from zoos and people's private pet collections, we have hardly any poisonous spiders in this country. So if somebody sees a tiny little money spider crawling past them and they're standing on chairs screaming, hollering and exhibiting every sign of being very, very afraid, then that would be defined as a phobia, because a money spider can do nothing whatsoever to a human being. It's no threat to a human at all, unlike some of the poisonous spiders you might encounter in other parts of the world. Therefore, that would be deemed more phobic because of the intensity of the fear and the lack of actual threat. Excessive compulsive disorder, sometimes referred to as obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. Essentially, we're talking about basically different names for the same thing here, is a very pervasive form of anxiety, coupled with very ritualistic behaviours to try and allay the degree of anxiety. Common examples of which are counting obsessions, for example. People who have to count certain things as they go along in order to feel reassured, or need to double check things a certain number of times, so they may be unable to go to bed until they have checked every door and every window 6 times. So they'll go round and round the house 6 times to make absolutely sure every door and window is properly shut and bolted and so forth. There's lots of other examples of compulsive disorders in that vein, so we'll look at some of those as we go along. Excessive compulsive disorder can also include other things than obsessive compulsive disorder. It can include other types of compulsion too, but we'll get onto some of those as we go along. Depression and the varying forms of depression are also considered to be disorders of fear and neurosis, that the sense of debilitating anxiety, dread, and the accompanying senses of hollowness that many people experience as part of depression all lead to, well, for some people they just can't get out of bed in the morning. Other people manage to function and manage to get out of bed and go about their daily lives, but they are bedeviled by this terrible sense of emptiness and isolation and loneliness and dread of the future. A key feature of neurotic disorders is that the person experiencing them, the patient or client if you prefer, is aware that what they are experiencing is very odd. So they know that their phobia is out of proportion, their fear of spiders or whatever it may be, is out of proportion, but they are unable to control it or reduce it, at least not without a lot of help. Likewise, the depressed person knows that their depression is not a normal, healthy way to be thinking about the world, but they struggle to do anything about it, again, without assistance and help. So the key issue here is insight, because there are other forms of condition that we'll look at as we go along, where the absence of insight is a defining feature. Now, with the various forms of depression you've got listed there, it's very rare for any of them to lead to anything criminal. It's not impossible. You might have somebody in the grip of a phobic terror who lobs a rock at the thing they're afraid of and accidentally smashes a window, which could have them hauled up for vandalism or something of the sort. However, it is extremely rare, and that's a bit of a tenuous example I've just given you to illustrate the vague possibility that it could lead to crime. That said, a large number of prisoners are diagnosed with various forms of neurotic disorder, probably the result of being in prison rather than necessarily something that they were experiencing prior to their conviction for whatever crime it is they may have convicted. And so even if the neurotic disorder doesn't result in the performance of crime, it can still be contingent upon experiences of the criminal justice system, and therefore something that may need addressing by a forensic psychologist. We're thinking of another example. Schizophrenia used to be defined as a psychotic disorder when psychosis was a more commonly used diagnostic label. Psychosis was seen as one of those conditions in which people lack insight, unlike the neurotic neurotic disorders. One of the key distinctions which was used back in Freud's lifetime of the differences between neurosis and psychosis was that whilst neurosis is essentially a fear-based disorder, psychosis is a split from reality. That is to say, the person's view and understanding of reality, of daily life, is significantly at odds with mainstream understandings. Now, this does beg some philosophical questions about the validity of mainstream understandings, but I'm going to try and resist the urge to go down that route, as much as I love philosophy, because we could be here till Christmas. But what people commonly perceive as reality is to some extent a social convenience, and therefore the psychotic is someone who is very much outside that perception, the person in the grip of a psychosis and their understanding of what is real and what is not real. So we do have some rather grey areas here, which is worth bearing in mind. We'll think about some of those grey areas as we go along. However, coming back to schizophrenia, this derives from ancient Greek words meaning a split mind. It's not the same as having two personalities. It's not a Jekyll and Hyde type thing, where an individual will flip from one identity to another. That is multiple personality disorder, MPD, which is a completely separate thing. So schizophrenia is a very broad label, so broad in fact that quite a few psychologists and psychiatrists over the years, one example of whom is Thomas Zetz, have criticised schizophrenia as being a largely useless label because it's too broad, it covers too many things, and therefore ends up meaning everything and nothing. So people like Zetz have wanted to get rid of the label schizophrenia and introduce other ways of understanding the problems people experience, rather than just lumping quite a lot of different people into one box under one label, when Zetz and other individual psychologists, psychiatrists say that label is just not a useful one to have. So these days what we understand by schizophrenia, and that has changed and developed over the decades, is that people, once they are labelled schizophrenic, will normally have that as a lifelong condition. They will have periods of remission when they get better, particularly with help and assistance, And some of those can be very long periods of remission, but there's no absolute guarantee they won't have a relapse at some point in the future. Those bouts of relapse, bouts when they become very ill, very unwell, can be quite long, going on for days, weeks, months, sometimes even years at a stretch. It involves a loss of contact with reality, and there's various ways in which that can manifest. But a common way is very disorganised thinking, so that their mind is all over the place, chopping and changing every few minutes, which makes maintaining a conversation incredibly difficult because their brain is going every which direction at the same time. And they're also quite often subject to hallucinations and delusions. The key distinction there being that hallucinations tend to be seeing things, hearing things, smelling weird things that nobody else can smell, unusual experiences involving the senses. Delusions is more about thought patterns than it is about sensation. So the conviction that your next door neighbour is really a Martian who is disguised as a human being and is out to get you, that is a delusion, because it's not necessarily that you've seen your next door neighbour pull off their human mask and reveal their Martian face underneath. That would be a hallucination, but rather it's a belief rather than a sight or a sound of something that nobody else can see or can hear. The loss of insight becomes particularly pronounced during the bouts of illness. So during remission, a person may be aware that they are prone to delusions and hallucinations at other points in their life and have had these disturbing experiences in the past, but during a period when they become unwell and the delusions and the strange thinking and the dissociative emotional states become very pronounced, during those periods they may well lose awareness that they are ill and start to think that it's everybody else who's peculiar and not themselves. So they may well not seek help. They may well struggle in all sorts of ways. And a lot of people experience all sorts of major issues with just day-to-day life, keeping a job, paying the bills, therefore keeping a roof over their head. So issues like homelessness and employment, poverty become major issues because of the severe difficulty an individual has with just day-to-day tasks. So ordinary things like brushing your teeth, taking a shower, turning up to work, going to the shops to buy some groceries, all of that can become incredibly hard for a person who is having a schizophrenic episode. In terms of how prevalent schizophrenia is, in Britain it's estimated around 1% of the population will become diagnosed with schizophrenia. In other countries it's rarely much higher than that. Some countries a little bit higher and some countries a little bit lower, but usually around about the 1% for the majority of countries. The onset is when people begin to manifest strange behaviour, not necessarily always the point in their life at which a diagnosis is given to them, because a person could be experiencing strange behaviour for quite a period of time before they see a doctor and get diagnosed. But the beginnings of odd behaviour, as you can see, they're anywhere from 15 to 45 years of age. So they might have been going along in their life quite stably, quite okay, to the age of 25, 30, 40, before very odd symptoms begin to manifest. So it's not a thing they are as such born manifesting, but rather something that develops as time goes past. Quite why it develops, what causes it to start developing, remains a topic of ongoing research and discussion. Different people have different ideas, but nothing is known for definite in that sense. So it's really quite a strange area of human experience, which is one of the reasons why people like Zetz think it's actually lots of different experiences and problems and issues that have all just been lumped together, and that's why it's so difficult to find any consistency between them. So the hallucinations and delusions we've already mentioned, and over quite a few decades doctors have developed antipsychotic medications which help reduce the amount of hallucinations and delusions that individuals experience and keep it more manageable. alongside those things which are referred to as positive symptoms, not because they are positive in the sense of being happy and upbeat and fun, quite the opposite, but rather positive because they are things that are there that shouldn't be there, so they have a kind of reality to them. The negative symptoms, by contrast, are things that ought to be there but are not. So it's what's missing from the person's life rather than what is present in the person's life. So apathy, social withdrawal, apathy, that sense of just giving up on life, having no enthusiasm, no energy, no hope for the future, just withdrawing, becoming quieter and quieter, more and more lost in their own thoughts, less and less interested in socialising with people at any level. And I do appreciate, obviously, some people are more introverted than others, but this becomes very, very pronounced. The apathy can also lead to not eating properly, not showering properly, not sorting out the house, washing their clothes, all of that sort of thing. So people can become, without wishing to be too unkind, a little challenging to be around because hygiene issues and so on have gone downhill. There is a particular type of schizophrenia called paranoid schizophrenia. Actually, there are several different types, but one of them is paranoid schizophrenia, which involves delusional thinking primarily around the area that someone is being victimized or targeted in some way. When they're not. I mean, that is the key issue. And obviously, some people do get victimized and targeted because the neighbours turn against them and chuck bricks through the window. That's real, that's not paranoid. Paranoid is when a person is imagining that they are being targeted when actually they're not being targeted at all. So that could be the conviction that someone is trying to murder them. It could be the conviction that they are being spied upon. It could be anxieties not only around, let's say, their next door neighbours, their relatives, but the conviction that the government is after them, or that aliens are trying to control them, or that demons are trying to possess them. And this is where it gets quite difficult, because there are some religious beliefs that allow for the existence of demons and destructive forces, and religions where conducting an exorcism is part and parcel of the belief. So distinguishing between a genuinely held religious belief and a paranoid delusion can be, at times, a very difficult thing to do. And you might appreciate that in terms of criminal overlap, where a person has these paranoid delusions and convictions that someone's out to get them, there may well be occasions in which they lash out at the person they think is trying to get them. So in other words, they decide to get them before they in turn are targeted. And that could lead to criminal assault, it could lead to all sorts of very unpleasant circumstances in which the deluded person starts to potentially become a risk to other people as well as to themselves. And by and large, most schizophrenics are far more likely to hurt themselves than they are to hurt anybody else, but occasionally they can hurt other people too. And there have been some quite high-profile murders committed by people who have been in and out of hospital with diagnoses of schizophrenia because they've become very paranoid and they've attacked, maybe stabbed or in some other way murdered an individual they imagine wrongly is out to get them. Quite what causes hallucinations remains uncertain, although a lot of psychobiologists suggest it's more to do with malfunctioning within the brain itself, a sort of a neurochemical issue, perhaps brought about by genetic patterns or possibly environmental issues, maybe excessive use of dubious substances in previous years that have triggered off some issue in the brain that now causes these curious sights and sounds and smells to crop up and feel very, very real to the individual experiencing them. We are all capable of internal thought processes where we sit there and we're looking at somebody on the other side of the room and thinking, what on earth are they wearing? We've got that dull voice in our head saying that to us. We know it's our voice. One argument is that people with certain malfunctioning issues may come to experience that voice not as their own, but as an external voice, as a voice of someone else. And that someone else could be the voice of God, it could be the voice of the devil, of an angel, the voice of the aliens, it could be the voice of some sinister government agency talking to them. They might imagine it's all sorts of things, rather than identifying it as simply their own internal thinking processes. However, other people have disputed that interpretation and said that's too simplistic. Actually, it's a lot more involved than that, and that people with schizophrenia do understand that their own inner voice is exactly that, their own inner voice. It's not some other kind of externalized strange phenomenon. Then we have personality disorders as part and parcel of modern diagnosis. Now, the ICD-10, the International Classification of Disease, which is a book of diagnoses very popular in many parts of the world, lists 8 types of personality disorder, whereas the DSM-5, which we're now up to, I forgot to amend the screen, that should be 5, not 4, we're up to issue number 5 now, lists 10 types of personality disorders. So different psychiatrists will have different diagnostic measurements that they work by. In this country, the DSM is more popular than the ICD in terms of usage within hospitals. That said, the ICD lists 3 clusters, which is the jargon term used nowadays: Cluster A, Cluster B, Cluster C. And we'll touch a little bit on these today, and we'll think about more of them at other times in the course as well. So the paranoid and the schizoid we've already sketched a little bit of, because not everyone who is suffering from a schizophrenic personality type is necessarily paranoid, so they're treated as 2 slightly different things. The Cluster B approach deals with dissocial, emotionally unstable and histrionic, which we'll go over momentarily, and Cluster C, the anancastic, the anxious and the dependent, which has an overlap with understandings of neurosis as well as with psychosis. So in terms of how we understand the patterns of disorder that do the rounds, if we're thinking of Coid's research back in 2006, Coid looked at the Cluster B disorders, which include things, as we just said, like antisocial personality disorder, which is incidentally the new phrase used to describe what was previously called psychopathic. Whilst you still find lots of books that use the word psychopathic, within medical circles that doesn't tend to be quite such a popular terminology anymore, and has been superseded by the diagnostic label APD, Antisocial Personality Disorder. It means almost exactly the same thing. It's just a new way of understanding. Borderline and histrionic and narcissistic personality disorders are terms you may well perhaps be familiar with. They get bandied around quite a lot on social media, probably more than they deserve to be. Narcissistic personality disorder, to give you an example, is kind of a massive form of egoism in which an individual is very, very, very self-obsessed and regards their own needs as being supremely important, far more so than anybody else's needs, and often exploits and uses other people as a means to an end and then discards them when they're no longer of any use, and can become quite aggressive, quite difficult to deal with if they see as somebody else as getting in their way. They may well take quite unpleasant measures to deal with anyone who thwarts them or denies them or get in their way. So Coid's research came to the conclusion that people with these Cluster B disorders were significantly 10 times more liable to violence than the general population who don't have these diagnoses. So, example that the antisocial personality, the previously called psychopathic one, lacks compassion, is a thrill seek, can be very, very brutal, may easily attack someone and cause them severe harm. Narcissists don't normally attack people as a matter of course unless someone really does get in their way and block them. In which case they may, usually they resort to kind of nasty, sniping, backstabbing type moves rather than full-on violence. But full-on violence is a possibility with the narcissistic type. The cluster A, which we've mentioned a little bit already in terms of paranoia and schizophrenia and so on, and cluster C, which is largely anxiety-based, have no more likelihood of physical violence than anybody else does. Significantly reduced in the case of cluster C, actually. Paranoid occasionally can lash out into violence, but not to a major extent which would draw the concern of the authorities. So we've already touched a little bit on psychopathy and said that it's now superseded by the antisocial personality disorder type. It is the essentially the same thing under a different label. Original research goes back to Hare, who developed the psychopathy checklist, which was a fairly long list of rather unfortunate traits that an individual might possess, and the more that could be ticked off on this list of traits, the more likely someone was to receive what was then called psychopathy diagnosis, and these days is the APD diagnosis. So the kinds of traits and behaviours, traits are usually attitudes. Behaviours are more things people actually get on and do. So in terms of attitudes and outlooks, extreme selfishness. Now a lot of you might know people who are quite selfish. That doesn't necessarily mean they're psychopathic or have APD. It's a extremely, supremely extreme version of selfishness where hardly anyone, not their husband or wife, not their children, their parents, anyone at all, is worth giving a thought to. Only they and their own needs count. Grandiosity, somebody who thinks of themselves as tremendously important, tremendously clever, tremendously special. You find that in the narcissistic diagnosis as well. Coupled with callousness, that they really don't give a flying fig for who gets hurt in the way, so long as they get what they want. If they have to tread on other people, stab them in the back, either metaphorically or actually, they will do so with little or no care for anyone else. In terms of behaviours, they hardly ever take responsibility for anything. If there are bills to pay, they don't bother paying them. If they've got if promises have been made to other people, they won't bother keeping them. And indeed, when they do awful things to somebody else, they will deny all responsibility for it and say, well, it wasn't me, it's your fault it happened, it's not my fault, it's yours. The antisocial bit, often a lot of petty crime, aggression, violence, drunkenness, parasitic lifestyle, sponging off other people, expecting them to pay the bills and pick up after them, clean up the mess that they create as they go along. The PCLR is a check, the psychopathy checklist. The R is the revised version from 1991, and again another revision in 2003. So just basically Hare's checklist, but slightly updated in the light of ongoing research. People who score high on that checklist start young, in essence. They begin their criminal careers at a disturbingly young age. And certainly some of the characters that we'll look at as we go along in this module have begun doing really quite horrendous things at an alarmingly young age. Committing murders when they were children, torturing animals when they were children, starting fires, robbing shops, getting up to all sorts of things even whilst they were still under the age of criminal responsibility. So really quite grim. And in terms of reoffending, that's the difficulty of getting rehabilitation with people with these issues. That no matter how many times they're in and out of prison or hospitals, they're still highly likely to go on to do other awful things in the future. They very rarely experience a proper rehabilitation and a change of their ways, which has left some people who are suspicious of the validity of this diagnostic label to question whether this is really fair. Is it just kind of writing people off, effectively saying they're not worth providing therapy for, and kind of dismissing them? Would it be better not to use such terminology and to go on trying to help people change and improve and addressing the perhaps significant and horrendous reasons why they might be such damaged people? Opinions differ. There's also dangerous and severe personality disorder, DSPD, which is used not as a psychiatric label but as what's termed an administrative label in prisons or secure hospitals, to effectively say this particular inmate in a prison or this patient in a hospital is extremely dangerous and has a severe personality disorder. Therefore, you have to watch them at all times if you're a member of staff or a visitor, indeed, and they can't be left in a position where they could lay hands to a weapon, cause harm and mayhem to others. When I say weapon, I don't mean guns and axes. They could use a pen to stab someone with. All sorts of things could be deployed as a weapon. So they've got to be watched because they are the kind of character that would lash out and cause significant danger and harm to other people. So again, assessment criteria there from Duggan and Howard, that they are more likely than not to commit a serious violent or sexual offence, engage in quite high-risk behaviours. To all and sundry, they score very high on Hare's checklist, and may indeed have several different personality disorders rather than just the one singular, which is worth bearing in mind. The term used is comorbidity, to have more than one illness at the same time. Treating one illness may not do anything to cure the other illness, or indeed illnesses if they've got 3, 4, 5 diagnostic labels at the same time. The element about the functional link between the personality disorder and the offending is to suggest that some people could have criminal intentions and an illness, but those two things are unrelated. So the illness doesn't cause the crime doesn't cause the illness. They just happen to be ill and criminal at one and the same time. But here, with Duggan and Howard's research, they're suggesting that the illness is definitely in some way causing the crime, such as the extreme callousness, the total disregard for others, thrill-seeking, maybe aberrant sexual behaviours and desires that could stem from an illness. That there is a direct correlation between the one and the other. We'll get on to APD later, but if you want to play that video link for yourselves and listen to that goes into more detail, I think you'll find that one quite interesting. So we'll have a look. In terms of how interventions are dealt with in prisons, once somebody is locked up and it's deemed that they have a mental health label. Now, it's not necessarily the case that if they have a mental health diagnosis they are automatically referred to a psychiatric hospital. In fact, in the vast majority of cases that doesn't happen, because there simply isn't enough places in secure psychiatric hospitals to accommodate all of the people with diagnoses. Particularly the case if the diagnostic label they have received is not seen as necessarily a direct contributor to the crime. They may only have become unwell after going to prison rather than having been unwell before committing the crime that's landed them in prison. So typical forms of intervention are the pharmacological, giving them medication, which is administered by the prison doctors and nurses. So antipsychotics for schizophrenia and so on, to deal with those sorts of issues there. So an example of a condition which is perhaps not related to the crime is quite likely to be depression. So the person may be depressed because they're in prison, they haven't seen their family in a long time, they're worried about their future outside of prison, they're worried about being assaulted by other prisoners, there could be all sorts of issues leading to high anxiety states and depression. So they quite possibly were not depressed when they committed their crime, but have become depressed as a result of being in prison, which is why they would be treated within the prison rather than referred to a psychiatric hospital. Things like CBT, cognitive behavioural therapy, and dialectical behavioural therapy are quite often deployed in prisons to help people, along with things like anger management courses, sex offender programs, drug rehab programs. All of those sorts of things are offered. Social and occupational forms of therapy, partly it's to keep people busy so they're not sitting around getting more and more unhappy and depressed, partly to equip them with skills that might give them a better future in terms of finding work and so forth when they leave the prison system, and therefore give them a bit more of an optimistic future to look forward to, that might then help to cope with their other disorders and issues that they might be experiencing. Now, in terms of issues, having just mentioned drug rehab, prisons also run alcohol rehab schemes. You might think that someone who is a prisoner cannot lay hands to alcohol, and also they can't nip down the pub or anything, therefore it wouldn't be an issue. That's not necessarily the case, just as drugs are smuggled in. So, well, it's relatively rare for bottles of whiskey to be smuggled in. However, prisoners are known, it does happen quite regularly, to have a go at brewing all sorts of things and putting their home brew, which often involves really quite rancid and unsanitary substances used to create alcohol, hidden away from the prison officers in various parts of the prison where they don't think the prison officers will notice what they're brewing up and then swill it. So alcohol can be a significant issue even whilst they're in prison, let alone in terms of being a significant factor in landing them into prison in the first place. So the British Crime Survey that's mentioned there noted that 47% of the people who were victims of violent crimes, somebody that had beaten them up or punched them or kicked them or whatever, believed that the person attacking them was drunk at the time of the attack. 17% of them thought the attacker was under the influence of some other substance, crack or cocaine or speed or whatever it is that they might have been on. 1% of the people surveyed by the BCS believed that their attacker had a mental illness. So by far, the majority of the people carrying out assaults were either drunk or off their skull on some other substance. Very few of them were seen as being mentally ill. Now, it has to be borne in mind that this is an issue of perception. That is to say, that's what the victim thought. And of course, the victim could have been wrong. It may well be the case that those 47% who thought the attacker was drunk did so because they could smell the alcohol in the attacker's breath. So they may have based that perception on some kind of material experience, or perhaps they were both at the pub at the same time and they'd seen the person who eventually attacked them having a few pints or whatever, so they may have known for a fact that they were drinking. But also on some of those occasions it may just be an assumption based upon the apparent behaviour. Staggering around, slurred speech, all the usual things, the apparent behaviour of the individual. Likewise, for the 17% who thought it was drugs, some of that may be based on the victim seeing the individual take a substance, but on other occasions it may have been simply that they thought they were. And it's of course equally possible that those people who did not think their attacker was either drunk or on drugs might be wrong too. Perhaps they thought their attacker was stone cold sober and in fact they weren't. So there is the room for the victims to be mistaken in their perceptions. But it is still nonetheless worth noting the rarity of mental illness as a perceived issue in physical assaults. The fact that it's much more likely to be drink or drugs. So, we've already said this at the start, but it's worth saying it again, that most people who experience a mental health issue are much more likely to hurt themselves than they are to hurt anybody else. That could be through suicide, it could be through self-neglect, not eating properly, not looking after their physical health properly, neglecting other medical problems, because they're feeling so withdrawn or despondent that they don't address issues that get worse and worse and worse. Sometimes they may turn to engage in other substances. They might start drinking a lot or taking illicit drugs alongside whatever medication they get from their doctor. And the combination of booze and pills can quite often polish people off entirely. 90%, you'll note there, of the people who commit suicide in the UK are perceived as experiencing mental distress. At one level, you might well say anyone who is committing suicide is presumably distressed, but this is a diagnosed form of distress, rather than, let's say, someone who is terminally ill, who makes a rational and informed choice to end their own life rather than stagger on in severe pain. So there may be people who commit suicide who are not experiencing any marked form of psychiatric distress, but are competent enough to make the decision to commit suicide for whatever reason. Flashing back to 2009, the population of this country back then was 43 million. It's much higher now. At the point of 2009, it was estimated that 1 in 6 adults had a significant mental health problem at some stage. That doesn't mean that they all had their significant mental health problem at exactly the same minute in time, but at some point in their life, their adult life, they would go on to experience a mental health problem. So that translates as just over 7 million people. 7 million people with a problem. On average in Britain we get between 50 and 70 murders a year. Occasionally it spikes a little bit higher, but normally it's around the 50 to 70 mark. So that's, compared to 7 million people with a potential mental health issue, that's very, very low, incredibly low. And there's no reason to suppose that a lot of the individuals carrying out those murders are not quite reasonably sane. When they shove Granny down the stairs, it's in order to get the inheritance rather than for some severe psychiatric disorder that they're experiencing. That said, the media plays a role in this. There's a lot of newspapers to be sold from highlighting individuals with severe mental illnesses who do commit gruesome crimes. And it creates perhaps a much wider spread fear of the mentally ill than otherwise needs to be. That most mentally ill people are not to be feared, they're to be supported and aided, rather than being people you should be afraid of or keep a distance from. But the hype in the media doesn't do anyone any favours, really. Seems to have skipped quite a few pages there. Yeah. Let's go back a bit. There we are. Not sure what happened there, never mind. So, back to talking about antisocial personality disorder. The reason, obviously, we're focusing on this is because, unlike the vast majority of mental illnesses, this one is quite likely to result in the performance of crime and the possibility that somebody might end up in prison as a result of the crime they've committed. So those with APD are likely to engage in all of those sorts of behaviours, which were also on Hare's checklist back when the term psychopathy was in vogue. But we won't dwell on each one of those in turn because they're fairly self-explanatory. But again, if you've got any questions about them, we can discuss them in the virtual classrooms Q&A. A lot of these behaviours are driven by a kind of a thrill-seeking, a wish to do more and more and more daring things, which is often coupled with a profound capacity for boredom. One of the arguments which Hare made a few decades ago was that people with psychopathy, as he was using the term then, had a low cortical arousal. That is to say, their brain needed a lot of stimulus to get it going and would adapt very quickly to stimulus. So something that was terribly exciting to them on Monday had become quite boring by Wednesday. And they'd need something different to get them excited on Thursday. And that he saw as primarily down to an issue of brain structure and neurochemistry rather than personal choice. Other people, by contrast, he said, who don't have that diagnosis are quite easily excited and can go on being excited by the same things on repeated occasions because their brain doesn't adapt in quite the same way when it's stimulated. So in other words, you can still be excited on Thursday by the thing that excited you on Monday. If you've got someone who is easily bored because their brain adapts so very quickly, one of the practical results of this is thrill seeking. That the person will seek an added level of excitement, an added level of something to get them going each time they become bored with the previous thing. So they've got to kind of step it up a notch each time. And to begin with, that may be driving fast cars, it might be going on roller coasters, it might be watching horror movies at the cinema, and all the usual sort of things that people do on an ordinary basis for a quick thrill. However, socially approved of quick thrills are going to get boring quickly. And that's when the individual is likely to turn to antisocial forms of quick thrill, turn to the sorts of behaviours that might be either just generally disapproved of as deviant or overtly as criminal. And so it may be breaking into somebody's house becomes a thrill. So they're not necessarily breaking into someone's house because they desperately need the money. Those kind of sociological arguments we've looked at in the sociology modules, where poverty is a driving factor to crime. It's more the thrill of doing it. The thrill of shoplifting, the thrill of will I get caught, will I not get caught, the thrill of vandalising or spray painting somewhere to see if you'll get chased down the street by a police officer or not. It's the thrill that drives rather than desperation for cash. Except maybe on Monday shoplifting is thrilling, but by Thursday shoplifting is boring, and the individual is moving on to some other form of crime which is a bit more exciting for them. And then that becomes boring, and so on. It goes on and on until eventually the concern is people end up doing really quite extreme things to gain their thrills and their kicks. And it gets more and more unsavoury as it goes on. Early childhood. Now, these psychiatric labels don't tend to be applied to individuals until they are legally adults. However, that doesn't mean that when they were children, their behaviour might well have drawn attention from the authorities, both worries on the part of the parents, but also the school authorities. They may have come to the attention of the juvenile justice system through various forms of dodgy behaviour. So they could well be flagged up as worrying years before they get an APD diagnosis. So things like frequent truancy, delinquency, bricking windows, graffitiing walls, all of that sort of thing, being very aggressive to other kids at school, aggressive to the teachers, aggressive perhaps with their own parents as they get older and bigger. Generally disruptive, the kind of child that documentaries tend to be made about, and possibly the kind of child where the neighbours start to wonder if they have 666 tattooed on their scalp somewhere. In terms of diagnosis, in this country, APD is made after the age of 18. So if a doctor is faced with a 16-year-old or a 14-year-old, they might privately think to themselves, I bet this kid's got APD, but they can't offer a formal diagnosis of it till later. They may, however, give them a different type of diagnosis that's more in keeping with their age group. One of the reasons that medical authorities wait till someone's at least 18, if not older, is because of the concern around labelling and labelling theory. That if a child receives a very heavy-duty labelling at a young, well, they would be at a young age if they're a child, then that can haunt them forevermore. and it perhaps denies them the chance to mature and develop and grow out of the kinds of behaviour. So it's an attempt to give a child a second, third, fourth, fifth chance to alter and amend their behaviour before this very heavy-duty label is put on their heads. Because once you have a personality disorder, in effect, you end up having it for life. You might, as you get older, learn to manage the personality disorder through therapy and medication and so forth, but the diagnosis doesn't go away. It's with you for life, and so it's quite a serious thing to be diagnosed with a personality disorder. All of that said, psychiatrists dealing with a 30, 40, 50-year-old, looking at their history, is liable to expect there to have been a juvenile history of petty crime and offences. So that before the age of 15, as it says on the screen here, that individual will have been getting up to all sorts of mischief. It's simply that they weren't in receipt of a diagnosis. APD is not part of schizophrenia or manic depression. People with the manic depression or bipolar disorder, swinging from being very, very low to very, very hyper, will often do all sorts of weird and peculiar things in their hyper phase, their manic phase, such as the impulsivity and the inability to plan ahead. However, people with a bipolar disorder don't normally show the total lack of remorse during their manic episodes. They are still compassionate individuals in a manic episode. They won't lose that, so that element doesn't overlap. But also, a person with APD is in this state of mind with the irresponsibility, the aggressiveness, the deceitfulness, etc., all of the time. They don't have down phases the way someone with bipolar disorder has. So it's a consistent 24-hour-a-day thing rather than something that is experienced in cyclical patterns. And the older they get, the more extreme and high risk their behaviours become. Some of the techniques used to try and deal with these sorts of problems in prisons and also with probation service when somebody's out of prison but still in receipt of support and therapy include, for example, DTC, Democratic Therapy-Based Communities. So these are communities, groups of people either within a prison environment or on the outside, who are learning to pay attention to each other. So they have to make decisions as a community democratically. Voting actually in a very kind of low-key way, not voting the way you will in a general election, but show of hands, normally that sort of thing. But after discussions and debates. So rather than one person barging in saying, I'm doing this and everyone else has got to put up and shut up, which is more indicative of APD, this is an attempt to get them all to sit and listen to each other, to learn compassion as a skill. And it's based on the assumption that compassion, or at the very least consideration, is a skill which can be learnt rather than being something innate you're born with. So you can learn to show consideration for other people. You can learn to listen to their opinions, take it into account. You can learn through a process of democracy that sometimes the thing you voted for is not the thing that everybody else voted for. And so the majority wins, and on certain occasions the vote will go against you. And you just have to learn to live with that. You can't go and burn their houses down or stab them or something because you don't like the way the vote went. You've got to learn to suck it up and get on with life. These are, at least those people who promote DTC as a valid concept, regard these as learnt skills, and that maybe these individuals failed to learn such skills at a younger point in their life when the vast majority of other people are learning these skills. But they can potentially still learn them even if they're 20, 30, 40, 50. They can go on learning these skills and adapt. It may be a bit of a struggle for them, a hard skill to learn, and they may always have that inner voice which would like to behave very, very differently, but the assumption is that they can learn to be more well adjusted as a citizen. There are other types of therapy that are also used and managed in different ways, and if you're interested in DTC, there is a YouTube link there which you can play at your own convenience, and or you just Google it in general, of course, as well as listening to that YouTube link. Now we'll finish by looking at this case study. It's a rather gruesome and unpleasant thing, and it's probably worth you pausing the video, get yourself a coffee, and listen to that. Click on the YouTube link, listen to that first, and then come back to the rest of me talking about it, because that YouTube link will take you into more detail in his case. I'm just going to give you a sketch of it here. He is, as you can see from the photo, rather an unsavoury looking creature, not the cleanest looking thing on earth. Robert Picton was a Canadian citizen, Canadian serial killer. He is convicted for the 6 murders, but it's widely suspected he probably killed round about 49 people, give or take. Possibly more than that, but round about 49. Except they haven't been able to prove all those other crimes, and the 6 convictions he does have were enough at the time to keep him in prison forevermore. Born in 1949, as far as I know he's still alive, in as much as I didn't double check before doing this PowerPoint that he's died recently, but I believe he's still alive. When he was a free member of Canadian society, he and his brother were pig farmers, and that plays an unfortunate role in the sorts of crimes he went on to commit. He had an early on conviction for attempted murder of a woman called Wendy Lynn Eistetter, and he may have been committing some of his other, of the 49 unconvicted ones, may have been committing murders already at that time. So it's not necessarily the case that Wendy Lynn Eistetter was his first unsuccessful attempt at a murder. He may have had other more successful attempts prior to that, but that poor woman was lucky enough to escape from him. 2002, he was charged with murdering Serena Abbotsway and Mona Wilson, and eventually other murder charges were then added to those charges after 2002. The crimes that Picton committed led to the Canadian government, particularly one of the without getting too much into Canadian politics, it's broken down into large kind of districts, regions, a little bit like the way America is with states, similar kind of a setup. And it's the British Columbia Commission that set up this Missing Women's Commission of Inquiry in response to his crimes. Not solely to him, because there are other people around committing other crimes, but because he was so prolific, and it created such a big scandal in the Canadian press at the time. Essentially what Picton did was to primarily target prostitutes, sex workers, many of whom lived a very, very precarious existence, hand to mouth. Mostly we're talking streetwalkers rather than women working in brothels, who tend to have a bit more security around them, in as much as if a customer attacks a woman in a brothel and she screams, there's a bouncer and the other women and so forth who can come to her aid. Whereas a woman walking the streets, or indeed rent boys and male prostitutes walking the streets, who get into a customer's car and are driven away, they can be attacked, they can be murdered, and there's not necessarily anyone else around at the time to come and help them or to hear their screams or anything like that. So it's far more high risk to walk the streets than it is to work in a brothel. And by and large, most of the prostitutes who get attacked tend to be streetwalkers rather than brothel workers, for the most part. There are exceptions to that, but for the most part. Lots of women had gone missing in Canada, including quite a large number of Canadian Indian women, as well as women of other ethnicities, but a large proportion of them were Canadian Indian women, and missing, never to be found again. Well, 6 of them were found in terms of bodies on Picton's farm, but an awful lot of them have never been found again. So some of them may, of course, still be alive and living in other places. That's possible. But the anxiety for their families and their friends is that a lot of those women have been murdered, whether murdered by Picton or murdered by somebody else entirely remains to be seen. But the commission was there to establish A, why are so many women going missing, B, why have the police not been successful in tracking them down and finding them, C, what can be done to prevent other women from going missing in the future. And a lot of this is quite racially charged because so many of those women are native Canadian Indians, and the concern is that perhaps the police were apathetic to those cases because of underlying racial issues, that they weren't making much of an effort to check into them because they didn't much care about the Native American population. Other people have suggested maybe it's because, as per a lot of Picton's victims, where those women have been sex workers, that it is sex workers themselves who are also, regardless of what ethnicity they might be, very undervalued members of society. And so when things happen to them, the authorities are perhaps, sometimes at least, slow to act, slow to intervene, slow to put as much effort into dealing with either disappearances or with murders and crimes of other various natures than they could be. So the Commission looked into all of this, and it made a variety of recommendations about what should be done to improve the situation for all of these disappearing women. I should point out there are disappearing men as well. It's not as if it's only women that disappear in Canada, but the bulk of disappeared people who are not tracked down and not found again were, and as far as I know, remain women, much more so than the numbers of men who disappear. The suggestion with Picton, which if you have, or you did make the choice to pause this recording and listen to the YouTube one, you already know this, but some people might have left the YouTube recording to listen to on another occasion. Having abducted women, he raped them, sexually assaulted them, possibly in some cases may have tortured them, and then gone on to murder them and feed the bodies of the murdered women to the pigs on the farm. There's a film starring Brad Pitt, one of these gangster movies, called Snatch, in which one of the villains in the piece talks about how various British rather than Canadian gangsters and villains from the days of the Great Twins onwards have disposed of their victims by feeding the bodies to pigs, and how quickly pigs will get through a dead body. They'll just chew it up and eat it. There's hardly any evidence left for forensic teams to find afterwards. I think about the only things that pigs don't digest is human hair and teeth. The rest of it they'll chomp up and there'll be hardly anything left of a person to be found, which is why there have been these challenges in proving whether or not he murdered those other 49 women, because there's very little of them left to find. There's also been a strong suggestion that Picton was not acting alone, that he would often host sex parties for various other local men to turn up, and they'd hire large numbers of prostitutes, and they'd all get drunk, and there'd be music and one thing and another, and the men and the prostitutes would go off into various different locations around the farm for fun and games, as it were. And the speculation is made that sometimes these parties, orgies, whatever you want to call them, might have led to murders being committed. In other words, was it just Picton himself murdering these women, or was he perhaps the coordinator of a larger group of men from the region, some of whom may have been perhaps men with a degree of political, social influence, who turned up for these sex parties, and so maybe sometimes the women might have been murdered by one of the other men at these parties, and Picton then disposed of the corpse through the pigs afterwards. And is the difficulty, a question that has been raised by family groups, pressure groups, is the difficulty in providing forensic evidence, at least partially down to maybe there being other men involved in these events who are at liberty and using their social clout to pull strings, effectively create a cover-up. None of which has ever been proved, it's all speculation, but these concerns have been raised, which would lift Robert Picton's crime into an even more alarming category than it already is anyway, and it's pretty bad enough to start with, but it would kind of shunt it up into a level of criminal conspiracy and really quite concerning organisation. Now, feminist criminologists have noted on quite a few occasions that not only are the vast majority of serial killers men, but their victims are by and large women. Now, there are some serial killers who target male victims, but by and large, serial killers tend to target women. The question raised is why? A variety of answers are suggested, and you might well have your own answers. You might want to pause this video whilst you have another cup of coffee and mull over what possible reasons might be. We can discuss them in the Q&A in the virtual classrooms. But one of the critical issues which at least a number of feminist criminologists and sociologists have raised is this an expression of a wider spread level of misogyny? In other words, if women have a generally low status in a given society, they're generally not well regarded, not well treated. Does it then come as any great surprise that the more violent and murderously inclined men might be, if they're going to kill anyone, they might be more likely to kill a woman than to kill a man? Because men are perhaps seen as higher status than women. And partly the argument there is around the likelihood of the criminal to target someone they don't regard as worth much to start with, but also perhaps the extent to which law enforcement shares the same misogyny and so makes less of an effort to investigate some crimes than it does others. A similar argument could be made in other directions, not just since the gender issue, but in other routes. So is a criminal justice service going to make more effort to investigate the murder of a very rich person than a very poor person? Will more effort go to finding the disappeared child of a millionaire than the disappearance of a homeless person? Regardless of the genders in question, because the wealthy are of more status than the poor, for example. Likewise, questions are raised about the amount of effort put into investigating the murders of gay men versus the murders of straight men. Is that because gay men are seen as more worthless, more irrelevant, less worth the effort required to catch the criminal? Possibly even the very jaded suggest that in some occasions where the group of people being targeted is very much on the outskirts of society, such as sex workers, gay men and so on, drug addicts, another example on the screen there could well be people involved in the criminal justice system, as well as day-to-day citizens sitting at home reading about these things in their newspapers over breakfast and reacting accordingly, who take the approach, well, so what, that's one less of that bunch of people I don't much like anyway in the world, and perhaps not even want the killer to be caught, because they almost see that killer as providing some kind of horrific public service by bumping off a group of people that they personally don't like anyway. Is that simply an attitude found in a tiny minority of rather warped individuals, or, as some psychologists and sociologists and criminologists have suggested, speculated, is this perhaps more of an endemic attitude, a kind of institutionalised attitude, found at least in some societies? It's not suggested necessarily as a worldwide attitude, but that in some societies that may be a more endemic view. Those of a more practical turn of mind have suggested that women tend to be not as muscular and well developed as men, And so if a male killer wants to easily overpower a victim they don't have to make too much effort for, they're much more likely to overpower someone who is physically smaller, physically weaker than they are. There are very few, if any, serial killers who go around targeting weightlifters of either sex, because obviously it would be a lot harder to overpower a murderer weightlifter or a kung fu expert than it would be to bump off a frail pensioner or a small child or someone who is just generally ill suited to fighting back to a large individual with a weapon who is attacking them. So it might be more of a pragmatic thing than an example of institutionalised prejudice even and bigotry. So it does depend perhaps on the pre-existing political outlook of the individuals making the arguments as to which of the possible reasons for these behaviours are being suggested. For the victimology, why are certain people more likely to be targeted than others? There's another couple of YouTube links you might want to listen to about this case. The second one on the right hand column is longer than the first one, it's more in depth. I'll leave you to, if you wish to, I mean it's not compulsory, but if you wish to listen to those, I'd recommend it, and you might well have a lot more to chip in and say during the Q&A session than if you haven't had the chance to listen to those. It'll give you more food for thought, let's put it like that. Now, next week, when we're back in person, we can not only discuss some of the issues from this week that you may still have burning questions you want addressed, but we'll also get into talking about drug laws in Britain and understanding the role of drug dealers, drug users, and how we perceive drugs in general. We'll do a little bit of a deconstruction around drugs, and we'll get on to talking about the fictional substance misuse that you have to address in your case study and the kinds of issues he has and how you can answer the questions posed as part of the case study. But once I've uploaded this, I'll also put up the link for the virtual classrooms discussion on Monday. And I look forward to seeing you then, as well as back in person in class the following week. Take care. Bye-bye.